Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing really well today. So I am so excited for today's video because today I have my first sewing project of the new year to share with you. This project is entirely self-drafted, so it was really fun to work on and it felt extra creative. So let me show you how it turned out. So here is what this project looks like. It is a blouse made out of this beautiful cotton lace fabric. This fabric is a Zimmerman fabric from Mood Fabrics. It has these really fun, kind of over the top shoulder ruffles and then long sleeves with a little bit of elastic at the cuffs. And then I left the lace detail here around the hem of the shirt, and I think it just turned out so pretty. It's exactly what I was wanting. I was taking inspiration from a blouse from Cezanne for this project, so I decided it would be a good one to experiment with some pattern making on because it's a pretty simple silhouette. This video is going to be a little bit different because it will be made up of two sections. In the first section, I will be showing you a walkthrough of how I adapted the bodice block patterns in Adobe Illustrator to create this silhouette. But I know that might not be super interesting for everyone, so if you are just interested in the sewing process, I will have a timestamp marked so you can skip right to that. So let's go ahead and jump in, and I'm going to get started making the pattern. Okay, so I'm starting this project at my computer actually because I'm going to be making a pattern for this project. And to do that, I like to use Adobe Illustrator. I find this so much more convenient than getting out a bunch of paper and making a big mess. So I really like to do pattern drafting digitally. And I followed a lot of different tutorials over the past year to learn how to interpret pattern making instructions into Adobe Illustrator. So I will link to some resources down below. I've watched a few Skillshare classes, and I've also taken an online class that's helped a lot with this digital pattern making. So for the pattern that I'm going to be making today, I am basing this off of a bodice block that I drafted using the instructions in this book. This is called Metric Pattern Cutting for Women's Wear by Winifred Aldrich, and I am using the easy fitting bodice block, so it's a little bit more of a loose fit. I've already made this block and tested it in the past, and I'm also going to be using a simple sleeve block from this book as well. So pattern blocks are just the basic structure that you can then modify to make the actual design. So that's what I'm going to be doing on the computer today, and I will show you this with a screen recording so you can follow along with all of the steps that I do to make this into the design that I want. So let me show you a little bit around Adobe Illustrator and how I edit these patterns in Illustrator. So I'm going to start by making a new artboard here, and then I'm going to copy and paste my bodice blocks into this new artboard. This is the easy fitting bodice block, and I have the full block drafted, and I've also divided out the front and back pieces, so that's why you see 3 separate pieces on this page. So I'm just going to arrange these so that they're easy to work with, and then I can start editing them. And just for my reference, I'm going to go ahead and add my inspiration image here so I can look at this as I am modifying the pattern. So the first thing I want to work with here is the front, and you can see there's this shoulder dart in the pattern. So I'm going to start by closing this dart. Now there's a handy tool in Illustrator called the scissors tool. So I'm going to cut the dart right at the point of the dart, and I'm also going to cut the lower corner of the bodice piece. Then I'm going to ungroup the pieces, and now this is divided into 2 separate pieces so that I can easily close the dart. Now to close the dart, I'm going to use something called the rotate tool. So I'm going to set the point of rotation at the point of the dart, and then I can just pull this piece over to the side and close the dart. So now you can see that fullness is transferred to the bottom of the pattern piece, and then I'm just going to use my scissors tool here to remove these dart lines. Now, after I deleted these lines, I was left with a tiny gap here at the top of the pattern piece, but I'll come back and close that in a few minutes after I've shortened the pattern piece. This pattern piece is a little bit too long for my liking, so I'm going to shorten it by about 15 centimeters. So I'm making a line that is 15 centimeters long using the line tool, and then I'm going to apply what are called arrowheads to the end of the line just so I can see where it begins and ends. This is a really handy tip I got from the online class Pattern Workshop, which I've learned a lot from, and I will link to that in the description box. Now I'm just going to align this line with the main front line of the pattern piece and make sure that these are lined up exactly. And then I'm going to use the scissors tool to cut the main pattern piece right where this line is lined up. So then I can delete the lower part of the pattern piece and then align the 15 centimeter line to the front of the pattern piece. Now the side I want to curve up by about 2 extra centimeters just for the look of things. So I'm going to make a line that is now 17 centimeters and again apply those arrowheads and then align this line to the first line that I made. And then once I've aligned these 2 lines, the markings on the end are going to give me the indicator for where I should mark my hemline. So I am going to use the pen tool and line this up with the top little marking and then connect this to the lower one and then make a curved line here so that this creates the nice even hemline. So now I can go ahead and delete the 2 lines that we made for markings earlier, and then I will use the scissors tool to cut this extra little bit from the side seam line and delete that lower amount as well. And then the last thing I need to do to close up this pattern piece is just close this little gap that was left at the top shoulder, and I'm just going to use the pen tool to do this. So now the only edit that I need to do to the back piece is to make sure that the length aligns with the front piece. So to do this, I'm going to start by lining these up at the side seam and using the rotate tool to make sure that my lengths match up exactly at the side. And then once I have those aligned, I'm going to use the scissors tool to cut the back piece right at the intersection of where the front piece is lined up at the hemline. And then using the pen tool, I'm just going to connect across with a straight line just to make this a little bit easier as I create the back curve. Then I can go ahead and remove all of the lower amount of the pattern piece. So now I can remove that guideline that I had made a minute ago, and then I want to extend the back by 2 centimeters so that it matches up with the front. So I'm going to make a line that is 2 centimeters long and then match this up with the back seam of the shirt. Now all I need to do is draw a curve that connects the back seam to the side seam. So now my pattern pieces are drawn out and I can go ahead and add the seam allowance to my pattern pieces because right now there is no seam allowance accounted for. I like to use the offset path tool to outline the entire pattern piece by 5/8 of an inch. That's written out in centimeters here just because that's what I work with in Illustrator. So I'm going to apply the seam allowance to both of the pattern pieces, but on the front piece, I don't want seam allowance on the front fold line. So I'm going to use the scissors tool to cut away this excess here, and then I can remove that and connect the front using the pen tool. And just for fun, I'm going to change these lines to dotted lines so that I can tell it's the stitching line, and then I can go ahead and label my pieces and group them together so that they're easier to work with. I'm not going to make any edits to the sleeve block for this pattern. I'm just going to use it as it is. And then I'm going to copy all of my pattern pieces onto a tiling template. A tiling template is made up of different artboards in Illustrator so that you can export this as a PDF and then print out your pattern pieces. I got this one from the pattern workshop class that I talked about before. I've also made my own and it's pretty simple to do. And this is an easy way to make sure that you use as few pieces of paper as possible. So now I can export this or save it as a PDF, and I'm just going to go into the saving window and then save this as an Adobe PDF. Now when I open this up on my computer, you can see that it is a whole bunch of different pieces of paper that will print out, and then I can easily tape them together. So now I'm ready to print this out, and I'm just going to make sure that the scaling is set to 100% so that I can make sure all of my measurements come across when this is printed out, and then I can print out all of my sheets of this pattern. And with my pattern printed and assembled, I was ready to get started sewing. So to make this blouse, I am using 2 yards of this beautiful fabric that is Zimmerman from Mood Fabrics. It's a cotton lace, and I'm going to work with this edging on the lower hem of my pattern. So the curve that I created earlier is actually a little bit irrelevant for this specific design because I want to preserve that pretty lace detailing along the hemline, and it also saves me from having to hem the shirt. So I'm going to go ahead and line up all of my pattern pieces and pin them in place and cut them out. Now for the shoulder ruffles, I wasn't 100% sure how I wanted these to look, so I decided just to go ahead and trim away some of the lace edging from the other half of the fabric, and then I will work with the exact measurements a little bit later on in the project. So now with everything cut out, I have the 2 back pieces, the front piece, both of the sleeves, and then the 2 ruffle pieces. So now I was ready to start the sewing process, and this is a pretty simple one to assemble, guys. I'm starting by just doing the shoulder and side seams. So I'm going to match the back pieces up to the front piece at the shoulder and side seams with their right sides together and pin these in place. Then I'll sew all of these seams with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and use my serger to finish the edge. While I'm at the serger, I'm also going to go ahead and use the serger to finish the back edges of the shirt so that those are already finished when I go to sew that back seam. Next, I'm just going to carefully press all of these seams towards the back and make sure that everything is looking really nice and clean. So now I can move on to the back seam. So I'm just going to turn the shirt wrong side out and match up the back edges with the right sides together. Then I can pin this in place and sew this seam, but I am going to be careful to leave about 5 inches open at the top because the neckline on this shirt is quite close cut. I want to make sure that this will go on over my head. So I'm going to leave a little opening here and then I can close that with a button later on. So I'm going to start sewing right here where I'm placing this pin and then sew this down with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And now I can trim away any excess thread or little bits of lace that are sticking out of the end and press this back seam open. I'm going to keep pressing this open all the way up to the top neckline, making sure that that seam allowance is folded to the inside. And then I can top stitch the button opening to make sure that everything looks really clean right here. So that's the main part of the construction done, and now I can move on to the sleeves. So I'm going to start by sewing in the sleeve side seams, just folding these together with the right sides together and sewing this down with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I will use the serger on this edge as well, but while I'm at the sewing machine, I'm also going to run 2 rows of ease stitching along at the top of the sleeve because we will be gathering this just slightly to ease it into the armhole. And with that seam stitched in place, I'm going to press the sleeve seams towards the back of the sleeves and make sure that everything is looking really nice and neat. And then I'm ready to attach the sleeves to the shirt. To attach the sleeves, I'm going to match the sleeve to the shirt at the side seams, making sure that everything is aligned really nicely. And then I'm going to match the center of the sleeve to the top shoulder seam. Then I'll adjust the gathering threads just to make sure that everything fits and pin the sleeve into the armhole. And once everything is pinned in place, I can stitch this entire armhole and stitch the sleeve in place and then use my serger to finish the edge. Moving on next to the sleeve hem, I decided a normal hem wouldn't work very well with this fabric, at least for my preferences. So I'm going to add a little elastic cuff to these sleeves. And to do this, I'm going to start by attaching some bias tape to the bottom of the sleeve. So I'm going to open out this bias tape and pin it all the way around the edge of the cuff. And then once I've gotten all the way around the edge, I can open out the ends of the bias tape and pin the 2 ends together. Then I'll stitch these 2 ends together before I go on to sew all the way around the edge of the cuff to attach the bias tape in one continuous loop. And with those bias tape edges attached together, I can trim away any excess here, and then you'll see that this fits nicely to the edge of the sleeve. So I can just pin this in place and then sew all the way around the edge of the sleeve. And then once I finished stitching this in place, I'm going to trim away any of the excess seam allowance because this fabric is quite bulky. And then I will turn the bias tape towards the inside of the sleeve, creating a casing for the elastic. So I'm just going to turn this towards the inside and making sure that that bias tape edge is turned under so that everything looks really clean. Then I'll just pin this in place and sew around the lower edge, making sure to leave a gap in the stitching so that I can add my elastic in a few minutes. So I've cut a piece of elastic that fits comfortably around my wrist and isn't too tight, and I'm going to use a safety pin to thread this elastic through the casing that we just made. I'll thread this all the way through and then pin the ends of the elastic together so that I can sew them together to create that full loop of elastic. I'm going to attach the ends of the elastic together using zigzag stitches, and a lot of them just to make sure that everything is really strong and secure. And then once I finish stitching this in place, I'm just going to pull on the cuff of the shirt so that that elastic goes into the casing, and then I can top stitch across that gap that we left earlier. Moving on next to the neckline, I'm going to finish off the neckline using bias tape as well. And because I opted to do the bias tape, I decided to go ahead and trim away 5/8 of an inch from the neckline. Because I had accounted for a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, this was going to be a little bit too tight if I didn't sew on a facing using a full seam allowance. So once I trimmed that away, I could go ahead and pin my bias tape all the way around the neckline in the same way that I did for the sleeves. The only difference here is that I'm folding under that raw edge of the bias tape so that this will look really clean once I turn it towards the inside. So I'm going to pin this all the way around the neck edge and then sew it in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to follow the same method that I did for the sleeves, trimming away the excess seam allowance here. There isn't a lot of it, but because this fabric is so thick, it's important to remove as much bulk as possible to keep things looking neat. Then I can turn the bias tape towards the inside and top stitch all the way around the neck edge. Now I can move on to those fun shoulder ruffles, and I ended up cutting these pieces to be about 5 inches by around 40 inches. I wanted them to have a lot of fullness, so I just went with the full width of the fabric that I had. So I'm going to go ahead and fold the edges, the short edges of the ruffles, to create a double hem, and then I can go ahead and top stitch these in place just to finish those edges. And while I'm at it, I'm also going to use the serger to finish the long edge of the ruffle that we will be folding to create a hem in just a minute. So now I can fold under the long edge to create a hem here. I did not feel like the serging really showed on the outside, so this finish worked just fine and I think looks really good. So I'm just going to fold this under about 1 inch here. And then I'm going to run 2 rows of gathering stitches along the top edge of the ruffle. Now I can pull on those gathering threads to gather the ruffle up as much as possible and make sure that the 2 ruffles are the same length. So now for the fun part, I can go ahead and attach the ruffles to the blouse. So the first thing I'm going to do here is mark the center of each ruffle so that I can align the center with the shoulder seam to keep everything really even. Then I'm going to experiment a little bit with the placement. I knew I wanted the edge of the ruffle to go over the sleeve seam, the armhole, and make sure that that was covered a little bit by the ruffle. I just liked the way that that looked. So I'm going to make sure that the placement is even and then pin these at the shoulder seams. Then I'm just going to continue pinning all the way down the length of the ruffle and making sure that everything stays really straight and even on the front and back of the blouse. Then I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and just top stitch everything in place. And from there, I can remove the gathering stitches that we put in just a minute ago. So we are almost done here. The last step is just to add a button and button loop to the back opening of the blouse. So I found a cute little button in my button collection that I thought looked really nice with the fabric. And I'm just going to sew this to one side of the opening. And then I'll make a thread loop to close this with on the opposite side. And once I finished that, this blouse was done. I was so happy with how this final product turned out. I think that it really captures the idea of the inspiration image I was looking at. I love the fabric and I'm really excited to have this piece in my wardrobe. I really love how this project turned out. It's one of my sewing goals for the new year to do a lot more self-drafting, and I just feel really accomplished with how this one turned out because it looks very similar to how I imagined it in my head. And I love the fabric. Having something lace and detailed like this is really fun because even though the blouse is a really simple color and a neutral, it feels my style and a little bit more interesting than just a plain cream colored cotton or something like that. So I really enjoyed working with the fabric and I love how the style turned out. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and seeing a little bit of the process of making the pattern in Adobe Illustrator. Let me know what you thought of that because I know that could be a little bit boring, so I'm just curious to know your thoughts, but I thought I would go ahead and share a peek at that in this video. Thank you guys so much for watching and spending your time here on my channel today. If you are new around here and would like to subscribe to keep up with my future projects, you can go ahead and do that by clicking the red button down below, and I would really appreciate it. Thank you guys as always for spending your time here on my channel, and I will talk to you in my next video. Bye!